Irashaimase, sir.
You speak Japanese? No one could understand me.
Please don't worry. Tell me what you need.
This dinner is for my late wife.
I see you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Let me take care of everything.
In the heart of New York City, a freezing rain was falling. On a forgotten bench, an old man sat shivering, disheveled, and lost to the world. He was invisible to the thousands of people who rushed past a ghost in the relentless machine of the city. He possessed a fortune vast enough to buy the entire block, yet in that moment he couldn't afford a single shred of human dignity. No one knew that this was Kenji Tanaka, a titan of technology worth billions. And no one cared. He was about to be swallowed whole by the city's indifference until one young woman, a waitress clearing tables in a nearby diner, did something no one else would. She saw him. What she said next wouldn't just save his life, it would unravel a promise made half a century ago. The rain over New York City wasn't gentle. It was a cold, hard, unforgiving downpour that fell in silver sheets, blurring the neon signs and turning the pavement of Lexington Avenue into a fractured, shimmering mirror. People moved like a single organism, a frantic river of umbrellas and downturned faces, their minds already on their warm apartments, their waiting families, their next big deal. They were insulated from the world by their purpose, their AirPods, and their profound disinterest in anything that might slow them down. On a slick, dark green bench, partially sheltered by the skeletal branches of a city-planted tree, sat an old man. To the river of people, he was nothing more than a piece of unfortunate scenery. His clothes, once a finely tailored tweed overcoat and wool trousers, were now soaked through, clinging to his thin frame and stained with the grime of the street. His silver hair was plastered to his scalp, and his face, etched with the fine lines of a life lived with intensity, was slack with a bewildering vacancy. His eyes, dark and intelligent, stared blankly at the rushing traffic, but they weren't seeing the yellow cabs or the city buses. They were seeing nothing. His name was Kenji Tanaka. In another reality, a reality that existed just 12 hours ago, that name commanded silence in boardrooms from Tokyo to Silicon Valley. It was the name behind Kyotech, a global empire built on revolutionary microprocessing and sustainable energy. His net worth was a staggering figure with 11 zeros after it. He was a man who moved the world with a single phone call whose time was measured in thousands of dollars per minute. But here on this bench, he was not Kenji Tanaka, the billionaire. He was a non-entity, a problem to be ignored, a flicker of social discomfort to be bypassed. A woman in a sharp business suit, her phone pressed to her ear as she barked orders, swerved widely around the bench, her expression one of pure annoyance. A young couple laughing under a shared umbrella fell silent as they passed their gaiety, momentarily punctured by the sight of him, before they hurried on, eager to forget. Inside Kenji's mind was a storm far worse than the one lashing the city. It was a fog thick and disorienting. He remembered fragments like shards of a shattered mirror, a meeting, tall buildings of glass and steel, the sharp, acrid smell of ozone before a lightning strike, a sudden blinding headache that felt like a nail being driven into his temple. Then, a lurch, a fall, the cold, hard shock of the pavement. After that, only confusion. He had tried to stand to find his way, but his legs felt like foreign objects. He'd stumbled through the streets for hours, the city, a cacophony of noise and light that his brain couldn't process. He knew he needed help, but the words wouldn't form. When he tried to speak to a police officer, only a guttural, nonsensical sound had emerged from his throat. The officer, assuming he was drunk or mentally ill, had simply waved him on with a gruff, "Move along, old-timer. Sleep it off somewhere else." Somewhere else. Where was that? He clutched at his pockets, a primal instinct. They were empty. His wallet, with its countless credit cards and the contact information for his security detail, was gone. His custom-made phone, a device more secure than most government systems, was also missing. He had likely been robbed as he lay disoriented in some alleyway. Without his name, his money, his connections, he was just a frail old man lost in a hostile world. A deep, bone-rattling chill was setting in. Hypothermia was a quiet predator, and he could feel its tendrils creeping into his limbs. He watched the warm golden lights of the diner across the street. The Lexington, its simple sign read. Through the large window, he could see people eating, talking, laughing. They were living in a world he could no longer access. It might as well have been on another planet. He felt a profound, soul-crushing despair. This was how it ended. Not in a boardroom, not in a penthouse suite surrounded by family, but alone, wet and freezing on a public bench, erased from existence by a city that never knew he was there. He closed his eyes, a single hot tear tracing a path through the cold rain on his cheek, and surrendered to the encroaching darkness. Inside the Lexington, the air was thick with the comforting smells of frying bacon, brewing coffee, and damp wool. It was a classic New York diner, a relic of a bygone era, with its cracked red vinyl booths, checkerboard floor, and a long formica counter, polished smooth by the elbows of generations. The clatter of cutlery and the low hum of conversation provided a constant, soothing soundtrack against the storm outside. Celine Vance moved through the chaos with the practiced grace of a dancer. At 26, she wore her exhaustion like a second skin, but it couldn't completely hide the light in her hazel eyes. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple functional ponytail, and her uniform, a plain black apron over a white shirt, was spotless. For the past 6 years, this diner had been her world. It paid her rent for a tiny apartment in Queens. It funded her night classes in linguistics, and it was the place where she tried to piece together a life that had been fractured by loss. Her boss, Arthur, a burly man with a perpetually furrowed brow and a heart of gold hidden under layers of gruffness, shouted an order from the grill. "Celine, pick up for table 5. 2 stacks side of bacon, crispy." "Got it, Arthur," she called back, balancing 3 heavy plates on her arm as she delivered them to a table of hungry tourists. She offered a tired but genuine smile. "Enjoy your meal." Selina was a watcher. It was a habit born from a childhood spent observing her father, David Vance, a brilliant but perpetually struggling architect. He had taught her to see the details others missed, the stress lines on a stranger's face, the unsaid words hanging in a silence, the subtle beauty in the city's grit. It was a skill that made her a good waitress, anticipating when a customer needed a refill or when a couple on a first date needed a moment of privacy. But lately it felt more like a curse. She saw too much pain, too much loneliness etched in the faces of the people she served. And tonight her gaze kept drifting to the window past the laughing families and the solitary students hunched over laptops. It kept landing on the old man on the bench across the street. She had first noticed him an hour ago. At first she'd assumed he was just another of the city's countless homeless waiting out the rain. But something was different about him. It was in his posture. Even slumped in defeat, there was a ghost of dignity about him. It was in his clothes. Though soaked and dirty, she could see the fine cut of the overcoat, the quality of the fabric. This man didn't belong on that bench. She watched as person after person hurried past him, their umbrellas forming a moving wall that rendered him invisible. A wave of anger, sharp and hot, washed over her. It was the same indifference that had chewed up her father. David Vance had been a man of integrity and vision, but in a city that valued profit over principle, He had been pushed aside, forgotten, and had died of a heart attack at 55, buried under a mountain of debt and broken dreams. This city, she thought bitterly, had a way of erasing good men. "Selina, you're dreaming again." Arthur's voice cut through her thoughts. He was wiping down the counter, his eyes following her gaze to the window. "Don't even think about it." "He's been out there for an hour, Arthur. He's not moving. It's freezing. And it's not our problem," Arthur said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "You bring in one, you bring 'em all in. This is a business, not a shelter. You know the rules." Celine knew the rules, but she also knew the look of someone who had given up. She had seen it in her own father's eyes in his final months. This wasn't just a homeless man. This was a human being at the very edge of a cliff. She finished her round, refilling coffee cups and clearing plates, but her mind was outside in the rain. She couldn't shake the image of the man's vacant stare. He looked so utterly lost, as if his soul had been scooped out, leaving an empty shell. Her father had taught her many things, but the most important was a line from an old Japanese proverb he loved, "Ichi go ichie." One time, one meeting. It meant that every encounter is a unique treasure that can never be repeated, and so it must be cherished. She took a deep breath, her decision made. She walked over to the counter where Arthur was sorting receipts. "Arthur," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm going to bring him a coffee and some soup. I'll pay for it." Arthur sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. He looked at Celine, at the stubborn set of her jaw, and saw the same compassionate fire that always made him hire her in the first place, despite her lack of experience back then. He looked out the window at the pathetic figure on the bench. "Fine," he grumbled, pulling a large to-go cup. "But he's not coming in here, you hear me? You give it to him out there. The last thing I need is him scaring off my dinner rush." Selina nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve. "Thank you, Arthur." She ladled a thick, steaming lentil soup into a container and grabbed a warm bread roll. As she pushed open the diner door, a blast of cold, wet wind hit her, and the roar of the city filled her ears. The short walk across the street felt like crossing an ocean. The rain immediately started soaking her thin shirt. As she approached the bench, she saw the man's condition was even worse than she'd thought. His skin had a pale bluish tint, and a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through his body. His eyes were closed. For a terrifying second, she thought he was already gone. "Sir," she said softly, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "Sir, are you okay?" There was no response. She reached out a hesitant hand and gently touched his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open. They were clouded with confusion, but for a brief moment, they focused on her. In their depths, she saw not madness, not intoxication, but a profound and terrifying abyss of fear. The old man flinched at her touch, a primal defensive movement. His eyes, though unfocused, were wide with a deep-seated panic like a cornered animal. He tried to speak, but what came out was a low, distressed mumble, a string of syllables that were foreign and unintelligible to the New York air. It wasn't English, it wasn't Spanish, it was something else entirely. "It's okay," Celine said, her voice gentle and slow the way one speaks to a frightened child. "I'm not going to hurt you. I brought you some soup. It's hot. It'll warm you up." She held out the container, the steam rising from it like a small offering of peace. He stared at it, then at her, his mind clearly struggling to bridge the gap between her action and its meaning. He didn't reach for it. His hands remained clenched on his lap, trembling uncontrollably. Selena knelt in the puddle forming at her feet, ignoring the cold water seeping into her jeans. She had to get closer to break through the wall of his confusion. "Please," she urged. "You need to eat something. You're freezing." He shook his head, a slight, almost spastic motion, and muttered again. This time the words were a little clearer, though still raspy and weak. "Doko ni, watashi wa." The sound hit Selene's ears and stopped her cold. It was like hearing a melody from a long-forgotten dream. Her night classes, the hours spent with headphones on repeating phrases, memorizing characters, it all coalesced in that one moment. The language was Japanese. Her heart skipped a beat. It was her father's language. David Vance had been obsessed with Japanese architecture and culture. He had spent years trying to master the language, and he had passed on his love for it to her. After his death, continuing her Japanese studies was one of the few ways she felt connected to him. She wasn't fluent, not by a long shot, but she knew the basics. She knew enough. She looked at the man, really looked at him, and for the first time saw past the grime and the desperation. She saw his features, the high cheekbones, the elegant shape of his eyes. He was Japanese, lost, sick and alone in a city where his native tongue was just another meaningless noise. Taking a slow, calming breath, she put the soup down beside him on the bench. She met his terrified gaze and spoke, her voice soft but clear, forming the words with a care and reverence she hadn't used in years. "Daijoubu desu ka?" "Are you all right?" The effect was instantaneous and staggering. It was as if she had flipped a switch in a dark room. The man's entire body went rigid. His unfocused stare sharpened, zeroing in on her face with an astonishing intensity. The fog of confusion in his eyes seemed to part, just for a second, revealing a flicker of pure, unadulterated shock. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He had been adrift in an ocean of alien sounds, and she had just thrown him a lifeline in the only language his fractured mind could still grasp. Selene pressed on, dredging up the formal, polite phrases her father had insisted she learn first. "Anata no namae wa nan desu ka?" "What is your name?" The man's trembling lips finally formed a word. It was a whisper, a breath of a sound, but to Selene it was as loud as a thunderclap. "Tanaka," one word. His name. A piece of his identity reclaimed from the void. A tear welled in his eye and traced a clean path through the dirt on his cheek. It was a tear of relief, of recognition of finding a single solid point in a spinning, chaotic universe. He looked at her, his gaze now filled with a desperate, pleading lucidity. He tried to say more, but his strength was failing. His body already pushed to its limit by the cold, and his medical crisis was starting to shut down. He slumped forward, his consciousness fading. Just before his eyes closed completely, he whispered one more word, a word that would come to define everything that followed. "Yakusoku." Promise. Then he went limp, his head falling forward. Selene lunged, catching him just before he slid off the bench and onto the wet pavement. He was frighteningly light. His skin was ice cold to the touch. The moment of connection was over. The medical emergency was here. "Arthur," she screamed, her voice raw with panic. "Arthur, call 911 now." The wail of the ambulance siren sliced through the New York night, its flashing red and blue lights painting the rain-slicked streets in frantic, strobing colors. Arthur had rushed out with blankets, his gruff facade completely shattered his face, pale with worry. He and Selene had wrapped the unconscious man as best they could, while she spoke to the 911 operator, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The paramedics were efficient, but detached. They saw a John Doe, another elderly homeless man, succumbing to the elements. They checked his vitals, strapped him to a gurney, and loaded him into the ambulance with practiced, impersonal movements. "Are you family?" one of them asked Celine, his pen poised over a clipboard. "No, I just found him." "All right, we're taking him to Mount Sterling Hospital. You don't need to come." But Celine was already climbing into the back of the ambulance. "I'm coming," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She felt an inexplicable fierce sense of responsibility for this man, Tanaka. She was the only person in this entire city who had a piece of his identity, the only one who knew his name. She couldn't abandon him now. The ride was a blur of medical jargon and the rhythmic beep of monitors. At Mount Sterling's emergency room, the chaos was overwhelming. The air smelled of antiseptic and human suffering. Doctors and nurses moved with urgent purpose, their voices sharp and strained. Tanaka was wheeled into a cubicle, and a curtain was drawn shutting Selene out. She waited for what felt like an eternity on a hard plastic chair in the waiting area, her clothes still damp, the smell of diner coffee clinging to her. She watched families receive devastating news and others explode in joyous relief. Every few minutes she would walk to the nurse's station. "Any update on the John Doe they brought in from Lexington Avenue?" she'd ask. The answer was always the same. "The doctor will be with you when he can. Please have a seat." Finally, a tired-looking doctor with weary eyes and a name tag that read Dr. Evans emerged from behind the curtain. "Are you the one who came in with the patient in Bay 3? He asked, his voice flat. "Yes." "Is he okay?" "His name is Tanaka." Dr. Evans barely registered the name. "His core body temperature was dangerously low. We're warming him up. He's dehydrated and malnourished. Frankly, he's a mess. We're running some tests, but my guess is it's a combination of exposure, alcohol, maybe drugs. We'll stabilize him, and then social services can find him a bed at a shelter." He was already turning to leave. Celine stepped in front of him. "Doctor, wait. I don't think he's homeless. His clothes, they were expensive, and he spoke to me. He spoke Japanese." Dr. Evans gave her a patronizing look. "Miss, we get all kinds in here. A lot of them are confused. They say all sorts of things. We have to deal with the facts. Right now, the facts are, I have a dozen other critical patients waiting." "But he had some kind of episode," Celine insisted, her frustration mounting. "Before he passed out, he was lucid for a moment. Something is medically wrong with his brain, not just the cold." "We'll run a tox screen," Dr. Evans said, dismissively walking away. "Now, if you'll excuse me." Selene stood there fuming. They weren't listening. They had already categorized him, filed him away in a box labeled unfortunate but not our problem. They were treating his symptoms, the hypothermia, the dehydration, but they weren't looking for the cause. The word he'd spoken, Yakusoku promise, echoed in her mind. It felt important. This man had a life, a story, a promise he needed to keep. He wasn't just a collection of symptoms on a chart. She went back to the nurse's station. "I need to speak with a hospital administrator or a social worker. Someone." The charge nurse, a formidable woman named Brenda, whose expression could curdle milk, looked up from her computer. "Regarding the man in Bay 3, Mr. Tanaka. I believe he's a missing person, not a homeless man. He's Japanese, and he's had some kind of neurological event. He needs a CT scan, not just a tox screen." Brenda gave her a long, appraising look. "And you are?" "I'm the person who's not leaving until he gets a proper care." Celine said, her voice shaking slightly, but her resolve hardening into steel. Something in Selene's fierce advocacy must have struck a chord. Brenda let out a heavy sigh. "Dr. Evans is a good doctor. He's just swamped. I'll see what I can do." It took another 2 hours of Selene refusing to leave, of her persistently and politely demanding answers before they finally relented. Perhaps to get rid of her, perhaps because her certainty planted a seed of doubt, Doctor. Evans ordered a CT scan. Selene was pacing in the hallway when he came to find her again. This time, his entire demeanor had changed. The weariness was still there, but the condescension was gone, replaced by a look of sober concern. "You were right," he said, his voice low. "The scan shows evidence of a TIA, a transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke. It would explain the confusion, the memory loss, the inability to speak properly. We're lucky it wasn't a major, cerebral hemorrhage." He looked at her with a newfound respect. His system is still too weak for major intervention, but we're moving him to the neurology ward for observation. You very likely saved his life, Miss Vance. Selene Vance. Well, Miss Vance. Dr. Evans said, "Now we have another problem. He's still a John Doe. We have no ID, no contacts. We don't know who to call." Selene thought for a moment. "He said his name was Tanaka. It's a common name, but he's Japanese. Maybe the Japanese consulate." It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. The call to the Japanese consulate in New York was made by a hospital social worker the next morning. Selene had stayed at the hospital until the early hours, only leaving when she was assured Mr. Tanaka was stable and resting in a quiet room on the neurology floor. She left her name and number, a flimsy thread connecting him to the world. The consulate, accustomed to dealing with lost passports and minor legal issues, initially treated the request with bureaucratic skepticism. An elderly Japanese national found unconscious with no ID, claiming his name is Tanaka. It was vague, almost hopeless, but they agreed to send the information through their internal channels, a routine bulletin that would be seen by embassies and corporate security offices worldwide. For 24 hours there was silence. Selene went back to work at the diner, her mind a million miles away. Arthur told her to take the day off, but she needed the distraction. Every time the diner door opened, she half expected to see someone asking about the old man. The silence broke, not with a gentle ripple, but with a tidal wave. Late the following afternoon, a motorcade of 3 gleaming black sedans pulled up outside Mount Sterling Hospital, stopping traffic and drawing stares. The doors opened, and a team of men in dark, impeccably tailored suits emerged, moving with the quiet, efficient menace of a special forces unit. They swept into the hospital lobby their leader, a tall, imposing American man with a military bearing. They were followed by a woman who commanded attention without raising her voice. She was in her late 40s with sharp, intelligent features and an aura of absolute authority. Her name was Evelyn Reed, and she was the Chief Operating Officer of Keotech's North American Division. For the past 36 hours she had been at the center of a frantic, top-secret global search for her boss, Kenji Tanaka, who had vanished without a trace after walking out of a private meeting. The hospital administration, which had been treating the case as a low priority, John Doe was thrown into a state of panic. Suddenly, department heads were being summoned, and Dr. Evans was pulled from his rounds. The name Kenji Tanaka went from being a footnote in a file to the most important name in the entire building. Upstairs in the neurology ward, Evelyn Reed stood outside Mr. Tanaka's room, her face a mask of controlled professionalism, though her clenched fists betrayed her anxiety. She took a deep breath and entered. Kenji was awake, sitting up in bed. The TIA had receded, and with IV fluids and rest, some of his memory and strength had returned. He recognized Evelyn instantly, the relief on his face immense. But there were still gaps. He remembered the blinding headache, the fall, and then a long, terrifying stretch of cold and confusion. And a face, a kind young woman's face, leaning over him in the rain. "Evelyn-san," he said, his voice still weak but clear. "I seem to have caused some trouble." "The only thing that matters is that you are safe, Tanaka-sama," she replied, bowing her head slightly. The relief in her voice was palpable. "We have been searching everywhere. Your security detail is under review. This will never happen again." Her focus then shifted. "The hospital staff told me a young woman brought you in. A waitress. Her name is Celine Vance." Evelyn's expression hardened slightly. In her world, an unexpected variable like this was a threat until proven otherwise. A waitress finding one of the world's richest men in a vulnerable state. It was a recipe for lawsuits, for tabloids, for extortion. "We need to handle this situation with extreme care." Evelyn said more to herself than to Kenji. "I'll have our legal team draft a non-disclosure agreement and a generous but final compensation package. We need to contain this." But Kenji held up a weak hand. "No," he said firmly. "I want to see her." "Sir, that might not be wise." "Evelyn," he interrupted, his voice gaining a sliver of its old authority. "She did not just bring me to a hospital. She spoke to me. When no one else could see me, she saw me. I need to thank her myself. Find her. Bring her here." His request was an order. Evelyn Reed, a woman who could intimidate world leaders, simply nodded. "As you wish, Tanaka-sama." When the call came, Celine was in the middle of her evening shift. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and utterly intimidating. It was Evelyn Reed's personal assistant. "Ms. Vance, Mr. Tanaka is asking to see you. A car will be waiting for you in 10 minutes. Selena's heart hammered against her ribs. Mr. Tanaka. They had found him. They knew who he was. A car. She looked down at her uniform, splattered with a bit of ketchup. She felt a wave of anxiety. She was a diner waitress. What business did she have meeting the family or associates of this mysterious man, Arthur, who had been watching her, came over? "What is it?" "They want me to go to the hospital. His people. They found him." "Go," Arthur said, immediately untying her apron. "Go on, I'll cover your tables. You should see this through." The car was a black Mercedes, a silent, luxurious bubble that transported her from her world of clattering plates into another universe. At the hospital, she was met not by a tired nurse, but by a man in a suit who escorted her past the front desk, up a private elevator, and to a section of the hospital she didn't know existed. The VIP wing. Evelyn Reed met her at the door to the suite. She appraised Celine with a cool, searching gaze. "Ms. Vance, I am Evelyn Reed. On behalf of Mr. Tanaka, I want to thank you for your assistance. Your quick thinking was invaluable." The words were polite, but her tone was that of a CEO handling a public relations issue. "I just did what anyone would do," Celine mumbled, feeling hopelessly out of her depth. "Few people would, I assure you," Evelyn said. She handed Celine a tablet. "Before you see him, we do require you to sign a standard non-disclosure agreement. It is for Mr. Tanaka's privacy and security. Our legal department has also authorized a payment of $50,000 to you as a token of our gratitude for your help." Celine stared at the number on the screen. $50,000. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. It would pay off her student loans, her father's old medical debts, and give her a cushion she could only dream of. It was a life-changing amount of money. And it felt like a dismissal, a payment to make her go away and keep quiet. She looked from the tablet to Evelyn's guarded face, and then towards the closed door of the room where the old man was. She thought of his terrified eyes, of the single word yakusoku spoken like a prayer. This wasn't about money. It was about human connection. "I don't want the money," Celine said, her voice surprisingly steady. and I don't need to sign anything to know not to talk to the newspapers. I just want to see if he's okay." Evelyn Reed was visibly taken aback. It was the first time all day that something had not gone according to her plan. She studied Selene for a long moment, and for the first time, her mask of corporate efficiency cracked, revealing a flicker of genuine surprise and perhaps a hint of respect. "Very well," she said, lowering the tablet. "He is waiting for you." Selena entered the room, her heart thumping, a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The hospital suite was larger than her entire apartment, with a stunning view of the glittering Manhattan skyline, but her attention was fixed on the man in the bed. He was transformed, cleaned and dressed in comfortable silk pajamas, with the fog of confusion gone from his eyes. He radiated a quiet power that even the sterile hospital environment could not diminish. This was Kenji Tanaka, the titan of industry. Yet when he looked at her, his eyes were filled with a gentle, profound gratitude that made him seem not like a billionaire, but like the vulnerable old man she had found on the bench. "Vance-san," he said, his voice soft. He gestured to a chair by his bedside. "Please, sit." Selena sat, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. "Mr. Tanaka, I'm so glad to see you're better." "I am better because of you," he said simply. "You looked at me when I was invisible. You spoke to me when I had no voice. You showed me a kindness I had forgotten existed in this world. How can I ever repay you?" "You don't owe me anything," Selene said honestly. "I'm just happy you're safe." He smiled, a warm, genuine smile. "Humility is a rare virtue. Your father would be proud." Selene froze. My father? How do you know about my father?" Kenji's expression grew somber, nostalgic. "I did not know for certain until Evelyn told me your full name, Selene Vance. But when you spoke to me in Japanese with such a clear and respectful accent, it reminded me of another American who spoke my language with the same heart, a man I met almost 40 years ago, your father, David Vance." Selene stared at him, her mind reeling. "You knew my father, knew him." Kenji's eyes misted over. "Selene-san, your father saved me. Not my life, perhaps, but my future. My dream." He leaned back against the pillows and began to tell a story that stretched back decades to a time before Kyotech was an empire, when it was just a fragile startup, and he was a young, ambitious engineer with a radical idea and no money. He had come to New York with a revolutionary microchip design seeking American investors. He was rejected by every firm he approached. They saw him as a foreign upstart, his ideas too risky. He was on his last dime, ready to give up and fly home in defeat, when he met a young American architect in a small noodle shop in the East Village. That architect was David Vance. David didn't know anything about microchips, but he recognized the passion and genius in the young Japanese engineer. They talked for hours, David sketching building designs on napkins, Kenji drawing circuit diagrams. "Your father," Kenji said, his voice thick with emotion, "was the first person in this country who looked at me and saw potential, not a liability. When he found out I was out of money, he did something incredible. He took me to his small firm, cleared out a storage room, and set up a cot for me. He let me live there for 3 months. He shared his food. He introduced me to everyone he knew. He never asked for a thing in return." Selene listened, tears welling in her eyes. This was a side of her father's story she had never known. She knew he had struggled, but she never knew the extent of his generosity. "One of those introductions," Kenji continued, "was to a junior partner at a small venture capital firm. Because of your father's passionate endorsement, the man agreed to a meeting. That meeting secured my first round of funding. It was the birth of Kyotech. He paused, taking a sip of water. When I left New York, I went to thank your father. I tried to offer him shares in my new company, but he refused. He just smiled and said, "Success is not meant to be hoarded, Kenji. It's meant to be planted so it can grow elsewhere." No, but I made him a promise. I looked him in the eye and said the word yakusoku. I promised that if I ever became successful, I would find a way to honor his belief in me. The word. The last thing he had said before he collapsed. Promise. Years passed. Kenji went on, his voice heavy with regret. I became consumed by my work. I built my empire. I always meant to reconnect, but life got in the way. About 10 years ago, I tried to find him. I learned that his firm had gone bankrupt, that he had passed away. I was devastated. I had failed in my promise. For years, my investigators searched for any surviving family, but the trail went cold. Your father, it seemed, had disappeared as quietly as he had lived. He looked directly at Celine, his eyes piercing. I came to New York last week for a business deal, but my true purpose was personal. I had a new lead, a faint hope of finding his daughter. I was on my way to a meeting with a private investigator when the TIA struck. I collapsed just a few blocks from where my journey began all those years ago. He reached over to the bedside table and picked up a worn black and white photograph. He handed it to Celine. It showed 2 young men grinning, standing on a New York street corner. One was a young, vibrant Kenji Tanaka. The other was her father, David Vance, looking happier and more carefree than she had ever seen him. "It is the greatest irony of my life," Kenji said softly. "I came to this city searching for David Vance's daughter to fulfill a promise. And when I was at my lowest, helpless and alone, it was David Vance's daughter who found me. Your act of kindness was not random, Selena-san. It was an echo of your father's kindness, reverberating across 40 years to save me once again." Celine could no longer hold back the tears. They streamed down her face as she looked at the photograph of the father she missed so dearly, and at the man whose life he had unknowingly changed. The $50,000 offered by Evelyn felt like an insult now. The connection in this room was something money could never touch. It was about legacy honor and a promise that had miraculously, impossibly been kept. A week after her world had been irrevocably tilted on its axis, Celine Vance found herself ascending. She rode in a silent, leather-scented elevator, a moving sanctuary of glass and polished steel, rising through the heart of a Manhattan skyscraper. Below her, the yellow cabs became tiny, crawling insects, and the roar of the city, she knew the city of rumbling subways, sizzling street food and shouting pedestrians, faded into a respectful, almost reverent hum. She smoothed down the fabric of a simple but elegant navy blue dress, a purchase made in a daze the day before. Her diner uniform felt like a relic from another life, a costume from a play whose run had abruptly ended. The elevator doors opened not into a hallway, but directly into the Kyotech reception area on the 80th floor. The space was a testament to Kenji Tanaka's philosophy of shibumi, a simple, unobtrusive beauty. The air was still and clean. A single exquisite piece of calligraphy hung on a wall of pale, unvarnished wood. The floor was dark slate, and the only sound was the faint, trickling water of a small stone fountain in the corner. It was less an office, and more a temple dedicated to commerce and quiet contemplation. Evelyn Reed's assistant, a young man with a polite, practiced smile, greeted her by name and led her through a set of frosted glass doors. Kenji Tanaka stood waiting for her, not behind a desk, but by a massive floor-to-ceiling window. He was no longer the frail patient in silk pajamas. but the man whose name resonated in global markets. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, he looked every bit the quiet titan of industry. Yet when he turned to greet her, his eyes held the same gentle gratitude she had seen in the hospital room, a look that instantly dissolved her nervousness. "Selene-san," he said, his voice calm and warm. "Welcome. Thank you for coming." "Mr. Tanaka." She replied, her own voice, a little breathless from the altitude and the surreality of the moment. "The view is incredible. Your father loved this city," Kenji said, joining her at the window. His gaze swept over the sprawling urban tapestry below. He saw it not just as a collection of buildings, but as a living organism, a place of immense power, but also immense fragility. He once told me, sketching on a napkin, that a city's greatness isn't measured by its tallest skyscraper, but by the dignity it affords its most overlooked citizen. He believed architecture could shape souls. "He did," Selena affirmed, a familiar ache of love and loss touching her heart. "He filled notebooks with designs for public parks, affordable housing community centers. He never got the chance to build them on a grand scale. Perhaps not in steel and concrete," Kenji mused, turning to face her fully. His expression grew more serious, more intentional. "But he built other things. He built a foundation of kindness for a young, penniless engineer. He built a bridge of trust between two cultures. His legacy is not only in the buildings he designed, it is in the lives he touched. It is in you." He gestured towards a low table where a thick, leather-bound portfolio sat. "Selene-san, I told you I would honor my promise to him. I have spent this past week consulting with my most trusted advisors. A simple gift of money is easy, and in the end it is empty. It is a transaction. But a gift of purpose, that is a worthy tribute to a man like your father. In Japan, we have a concept called on. It is a debt of gratitude, a deep obligation, that must be repaid, not with a single gesture, but with a lifetime of sincere action. My on to your father is immeasurable." He picked up the portfolio and held it out to her. Selene took it, her hands trembling slightly. The embossed title on the cover was simple, elegant, and it struck her with the force of a physical blow, the Vance Foundation. Her breath caught in her throat. She opened it. The pages were filled not with dry legal jargon, but with life with vision. There were stunning architectural renderings, detailed mission statements, and budget proposals that made her head spin. The Foundation's purpose was clearly articulated, a dual mission to provide substantial grants for innovative young architects focused on sustainable and humanitarian urban design, and to establish a robust cultural exchange program for promising Japanese and American architectural students to learn from one another. "Your father gave me my start," Kenji explained, his voice a steady presence beside her, as she absorbed the information. "Now I want his name, the name of David Vance, to give countless others their start, to ensure his ideals are not just a memory in a notebook, but a living, breathing force for good in the world. I am seeding this foundation with an initial endowment of $100 million. Selene swayed, feeling lightheaded. The number was abstract, astronomical, utterly disconnected from her reality of counting tips at the end of a long shift. She sank into a plush armchair, the heavy portfolio resting in her lap like a sacred text. But a foundation is just an idea on paper, without the right person to guide it. Kenji continued, his eyes locked on hers. It cannot be run by bureaucrats or accountants who see only numbers. It needs a leader with integrity, with fierce compassion, and with a direct personal connection to the man who inspired it all. It needs a guardian of its spirit. It needs you, Selene. I want you to be the first executive director of the Vance Foundation." The silence in the room was absolute. Selena's mind went blank, then flooded with a tidal wave of conflicting thoughts. It was absurd, a joke. She looked down at her hands, half expecting to see them covered in dish soap. "I'm a waitress. I serve coffee and clear tables. I'm taking night classes in linguistics because I like the history of words. What do I know about running $100 million foundation? What would people say? They would call me an opportunist, the waitress who tricked a billionaire." The self-doubt was a physical, nauseating weight in her stomach. "Mr. Tanaka," she stammered, finally finding her voice. I can't. I am so deeply honored, more than I can ever say. But I'm not qualified. I don't have a business degree. I've never managed a budget. I don't know the first thing about corporate governance or architecture, really. Not in the way you mean." Kenji listened patiently until she finished his expression, unwavering. "You are correct," he said, and her heart sank. "You do not have those specific qualifications. I could hire any one of 100 people from Yale or Harvard with perfect resumes who have them. But I am not looking for a resume. I am looking for a character. Let me tell you what I see. I see a young woman who at the end of a long day chose to walk out into a freezing rainstorm to help a complete stranger. I see a woman who faced down dismissive paramedics and cynical doctors to advocate for someone who had no voice. I see a woman who, when offered a life-changing sum of money that would solve all her problems, refused it because her integrity was not for sale. That, he said, leaning forward slightly, his voice resonating with conviction, is the CV I am interested in. You possess the one qualification that cannot be taught a soul that is aligned with the mission. You can hire people with financial expertise, Selena-san. You cannot hire a heart. He walked back to the table and opened the portfolio for her, turning to a specific section. Look here. It was a detailed proposal for the Foundation's flagship project, a competition to design a new state-of-the-art public library and community center in a low-income neighborhood in Brooklyn. It emphasized open spaces, natural light, and multifunctional areas for learning and community gathering. It was the exact kind of people-centric project her father had sketched on countless nights at their small kitchen table. Seeing it there, rendered in beautiful professional detail, was the turning point. This wasn't charity. It wasn't a handout. This was a continuation. It was a chance to take all her father's forgotten dreams and give them a home, a purpose, a future. The fear didn't vanish, but a new feeling rose up to meet it, a powerful, electrifying sense of purpose. It was a chance to transform her own life from one of quiet survival to one of profound meaning. A slow smile, the first truly joyful and unburdened one she had felt in years, spread across her face. It was a smile that held the promise of a future her father would have been proud to witness. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong, the words feeling more right than any she had ever spoken. "Yes, Mr. Tanaka. I would be honored." A look of immense satisfaction and relief settled on Kenji's face. He bowed his head slightly, a traditional gesture of deep respect. "Yoroshiku onegaishimasu," he said. "I look forward to working with you." He walked back to the window, and she rose to join him. From the 80th floor, the little green park bench where they had met was an invisible, insignificant speck. But for both of them, it would forever remain the most sacred ground in all of New York City. It was a quiet testament that fortunes could be lost in an instant, but a single act of seeing, of reaching out, could reverberate across generations. It was the place where a promise a yakusoku made 40 years ago under the sign of a blooming sakura had finally, impossibly, and beautifully come home. The story of Kenji Tanaka and Selene Vance isn't just about a billionaire and a waitress. It's a powerful reminder of the invisible threads that connect us all. It shows how one small act of kindness, of truly seeing another human being, can change the entire trajectory of a life, and even fulfill a promise made decades ago. In a world that often rushes past, encouraging us to ignore the problems that aren't our own, Selene's story challenges us to stop, to listen, and to connect. It reminds us that the greatest value we possess isn't in our bank accounts, but in our capacity for compassion. If this story moved you and made you think, please take a moment to show your support. Smash that like button to help this story reach more people. Share it with someone who needs to hear a message of hope and human kindness. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next story that explores the extraordinary moments hidden in ordinary lives. What would you have done if you saw the man on the bench? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for listening.